Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May 1st, I can't believe it's May 1st, our May 1st webinar with Tom Siechert from Fresno State in California. Tom is manager for the ATI procurement program. That's a mouthful for me.
It is.
And he's also
barely fits on a business card.
He's also the campus senior IT buyer, and he's a member of the CSU Accessible Technology Network and the CSU Accessible Procurement Standardization Work Group. Wow, I can't believe I can get this all out this morning, Tom. But I'm really happy to have you here. It's been fun talking with you at conferences, and I've waited for at least a year or so for this project to come to fruition for you so that you could present it to our group. So I'm really happy that you're able to share your information with us this morning. So welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Marlene. Thanks for the warm introduction. Glad to be here. As Marlene said, had the opportunity to meet with her and see her at various conferences, so kind of really excited to go over what we're doing in the CSU for accessible procurement. As Marlene mentioned, I have this super long title, the ATI Procurement Program Manager. I kind of have a unique role in that I have a split role. Supposedly it's a 50-50 role between ATI and procurement implementation type duties, and retaining my original role, which I was hired in January of 2003 to do, which is be the senior IT buyer for our campus. I'm also the chair of our ATI procurement subcommittee at our campus, and I sit on the ATI steering committee. Like Marlene mentioned, I'm also a part of what we call the CSU Accessible Technology Network, and basically what that is a system-wide group in the Cal State University where you have basically people that the Chancellor's Office buys out our time to work on kind of collaborative projects for the system. In my case, most of the work that I do is related to procurement type issues. And I was also a contributor to our Accessible Procurement Standardization Work Group, which is kind of the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today. And that's an effort that has been going since 2011. So just to give you some background, like I mentioned, when I started working for the university, my main role has been the IT buyer. So in late 2006, our Chancellor's Office implemented and started the Accessible Technology Initiative. And me being in the purchasing department, we had some concerns. Okay, this is really going to be difficult to do. How is this going to impact a lot of the things that we do in purchasing? How is it going to impact our buyers' workloads? What's going to happen to processing times when we have to do an ATI review? And things like, what should the role be of our purchasing staff? We had concerns such as, okay, so how are we going to evaluate accessibility in the context of our purchases? What role does accessibility play in determining who to award to and what products to buy? And the biggest one that's been a concern since the beginning and still is what do we do for our time-sensitive rush-type orders, especially ones that are what I call VIP orders, ones that come down from, say, the VP level or presidential level. How do we make sure that whatever process we put in place for accessibility doesn't hold that up? So I want to talk about three different myths today. The first one is kind of a perception that campuses have that, well, accessibility and procurement is they're going to handle it. That's theirs to take care of. When in the reality is, typically purchasing staff don't have the technical background. They don't have typically a background about assistive technologies and or understand how persons with disabilities use assistive technology. And what we found since 2006 is that accessibility review really needs to be something that's a multidisciplinary, collaborative process, and the process needs to be driven by the subject matter experts, which are not in purchasing, from IT, disability services, or human resources. And procurement staff should concentrate on procurement type functions and tasks. The next common myth that we've run across is, well, let's just buy the accessible products, right? Another common question I hear is, well, is it accessible? And it really kind of indicates, well, we need to do some education around that, because accessibility of technology really isn't, is it accessible? It's what level of accessibility does it have, and what are the gaps that it does have. And from a purchasing perspective, it's really challenging to try to compare different solutions that are out there and say which one is more accessible. So as I mentioned, our system-wide accessible technology initiative was established in 2006 by our Chancellor's Office for our whole system. The scope of it is web, instructional materials, and procurement. And initially, for procurement, what the strategy was is we're going to do a phased implementation, and we're going to use dollar thresholds and implement it at various dollar thresholds until we cover everything. So, for example, the first deadline, we said we're going to make everything accessible for all orders 50,000 and above. So that's the initial thought when this was put in place. And over time, we've learned quite a bit, about what it takes to implement such a large change in a large university system. As I was talking to Marlene earlier, in our system, we have campuses that are as few as 1,000 students up to kind of our mega campuses that are more than 38,000 students now. And because we are kind of all just learning as we were going, there wasn't really, best practices or suggestions coming from the Chancellor's Office to say this is how you implement this. And because of that, what you had was, the different campuses did different processes. The campuses had different levels of expertise and different levels of staffing devoted to the initiative. So based upon all the things that we learned from 2006 to 2012, the Chancellor's Office came out and updated our plan on how to implement our ATI. And basically what it says in a nutshell is, because of the different resources, the different capacities, we're going to use a impact-based prioritization for all of our efforts, including procurement. So we're going to look at, so instead of a blanket kind of we're going to do everything by a certain date, we changed it to say, we're going to address the things that are the highest priority. We're going to focus on improving our processes, making progress, documenting that progress, and in the process, drive improvements to accessibility. So this chart here basically kind of shows visually what we learned. So I looked at the purchases for our campus in 2014, and we purchased just over 1,600 IT-related items. So in the olden days, we would have said, we need to look at all of these things, and everything needs to be accessible. But that's just not realistic, and it really doesn't even make sense. If you look a little bit deeper into those numbers, what I found was only 700 of those items are actually items that need to be accessible based upon Section 508. When you dive a little bit deeper into the numbers, I found that almost 500 of those items were for personal use type things, such as a personal printer, a personal scanner that only one person is going to ever use, a single-use license for one person. So basically what that leaves you with is about 200 items in a year that really need a further scrutiny and further review. So 200 is much more manageable than 1,600. So as I mentioned, the Chancellor's Office learned that we really need to standardize, especially when it comes to procurement. We can't have 23 different campuses doing things at least 23 different ways and different forms. We're asking different things of our vendors. We're evaluating things differently. From a chancellor's office point of view, we really need to say this is what we're doing as a system. So we began this process in 2011. The chancellor's office invited people from 6 different campuses to participate. And it's multidisciplinary. It had people from procurement, people from disability services, IT folks. We had people from really small campuses all the way up to our really large campuses. And the goal and our charge for our group was to document a process that, a singular process that can then be adapted or adopted by campuses to fit their needs. So what did we expect to achieve by doing this? We want to procure the most accessible products. We want to create plans for how we're going to provide accommodations for the inevitable purchase of technologies that have issues. We want to promote a culture of accessibility. We want to promote the idea that this is an institution-wide effort. It's not just one office on your campus. And we want to speak with one voice to vendors instead of at least 23. And, we would have vendors that are just so confused. I would talk to them and say, well, you're asking for something completely different than your sister campuses. So we want to speak with one voice, be asking the same questions, be evaluating them the same way. And we want processes that are consistent, repeatable, and most of all, meaningful. And in the end, we're going to drive real-world improvements to the information and communication technology that we're purchasing. One of the other findings from our group was what we say are the keys to be able to do this are you really need strong executive level support and sustained support. And one of the things that we developed was a list of all the roles and responsibilities that we feel are necessary to implement this. And it's really educational and should be eye-opening to the different campuses to say, here's all the things that need to happen. You need to figure out who's assigned to do these things, but here's all these things that need to happen that I think people just kind of assumed that it's all handled by purchasing, and there wasn't an understanding of all the different activities that really need to happen. And related to that is we highly recommend that campuses designate a singular person to, an IT accessibility coordinator. We call them an ATI designee in our system to really lead those efforts. You really need that. So I'll use a real-world case study from our campus about why having that person is so important. So our campus adopted an online student training solution recently, and the details of it, the purchasing department wasn't even involved. We didn't even become aware of it until actually it was ready to launch. And what we found out after the fact was that this was a $0 agreement, which could sound familiar, like Gmail or Google Apps. And because of that, the other campus folks didn't even realize that the purchasing office needed to be involved. And this particular training solution is really high impact. It's required for every single student, so 24,000 students, and it's very high stakes in that if you don't complete it in a timely manner, a registration hold will be placed on your account. And what we found after, we're now in kind of a panic mode because it's about to launch, is it had significant issues with accessibility, and at least multiple groups of persons with disabilities wouldn't be able to use it at all. It just wouldn't be usable. So the takeaways from this is your purchasing department may not always be involved of some of the information and communication technology that might be adopted. That designee role is key. Currently, I am the person on this campus that is in that role. So if I wasn't in that role, people would not have notified me before it launched, and we wouldn't have been able to do some of the proactive work we did really quickly to get alternate media in place so that people could use this they could complete this process, this training, in a different way and not have these negative things happen to them, such as having a hold put on their registration. So what is it? So the CSU accessible procurement process or framework basically consists of these items. There's defined process steps. There's different standard boilerplate forms that we developed. There's guidance and how to use the different processes in the forms and different training materials. And then there's also frequently asked questions. I've listed the URL below here, so you can go after the presentation if you want to look through our website and see all of these different pieces of the process. So kind of going to the old way, and then I'll describe the new way. Throughout our system, it was pretty common practice that what procurement would do would be we'd collect VPATs. For the most part, we'd just collect them. We might question a thing or two, but we'd file them away. There would be limited or no real-world verification of the claims or testing. There was really a big reliance upon the use of exceptions or exemptions to say, okay, we're going to purchase this thing anyway, and in a lot of cases, that was the end of the process. So because we weren't doing any sort of testing or verification of accessibility, our plans to provide accommodations were so generic to be pretty much not very useful. So in the case of if you had a student or staff member that needed accommodation for inaccessible technology, you'd really be scrambling to provide that because the plan just didn't have enough information to be that actionable. And because of all of the above, the vendors remained uninformed about the different gaps that existed. The products were not remediated, and we really kind of had this procurement-centric focus, and really people thought that, well, that's something procurement handles. The new way is really different. So even in the case of VPATs, which are kind of inherently problematic, we're not collecting and filing. We're going to question everything. We're going to require the vendors to revise the VPAT based upon either the review of the VPAT itself or upon the testing that we would do. We're going to verify the claims that they make, especially for the high-impact procurements. We're intentionally, as a system, choosing to de-emphasize the role of the exception exemptions. Because basically, at the end of the day, even if you have this exemption or exception, the campus is still on the hook to provide equal access to a person. And so Section 504 and Title II of ADA are very much still in play, even if you get a pass for 508 in effect. So because we're doing more verification of accessibility, our accommodation plans, it's what we call the equally effective access plan in our system. We're requiring that it's specific, that we would say we know what the likely areas of inaccessibility are in any given solution, and this is our plan for what we would do to provide that access to these people that are likely affected. We also share this information with our vendors, and we get them to commit to remediating the gaps that we find. And in the context of this standardized process, we have a forum that we call the accessibility roadmap that we require them to address each of the gaps that we found and tell us, kind of what priority, when it's going to be addressed. And then we put that in the contract that they will do what's in the roadmap. And because of
if I could read the chat out for you, you have a question from Kari going, how are you doing the testing of these VPATs?
Sure. So on the VPATs, what we're currently doing is what we call a VPAT review, which I'll talk about a little bit later when I go into the various ways that we do accessibility reviews. So it ranges so the least, the quickest, easiest review that we do is what we call a VPAT review, and then it goes all the way up to hands-on testing. Testing with end users is the more extensive, more detailed, more meaningful reviews. but I'll get into the VPAT review and what that means in a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Tom.
Okay. Great, thanks. So now I want to walk through the different process steps. As I mentioned, there's 4 different steps that we're recommending. The first, gathering information about the purchase, the product, and the accessibility. Second is reviewing that information. The third is actually, this is the meat of it, where we're actually doing, the accessibility review. And the last piece is placing the order and the things that go along with that. So I think it's important to look at, no matter what kind of accessibility review that you're doing, from even the VPAT review to the full-on testing, what is the purpose of this? What are we trying to accomplish? Because in the early days in our system, we would have campuses that had, pretty detailed processes in place. It looks good. But at the end of the day, it didn't really do anything to kind of meet these goals that I'm talking about here. So the first thing is we have to be able to determine specific accessibility gaps. So this is kind of an area where the VPAT-centric approach isn't that helpful. So I believe I kind of started to discuss this with you, Marlene, in that in the CSU, originally we had what we called a VPAT database. So the idea was creating a system-wide repository where different campuses would collect VPATs and put them in one place. Campuses could rely upon it, work that other campuses had done, and use that and kind of save time and energy. But the problem is that VPATs pretty much are just problematic. They're just unreliable, and they're problematic for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which is it doesn't really get you necessarily to a place where you're documenting specific accessibility gaps that you could then use to perhaps discover a workaround for what issues it has in the current iteration of the product, or B, enable you to develop an alternate access plan, or C, most importantly, communicate those issues to the vendors who, by and large, are still mostly not that knowledgeable about accessibility. I mean, that's not true for the big vendors. The big vendors are mostly on board now. They understand it. They're working towards accessibility. But a lot of the rest, I get this all the time when I approach vendors. I'll talk about accessibility, and they don't even know what the term means. So it's really important to, whatever you do in this accessibility review process, you're able to provide that information so you can, 1, increase access, and B, reduce the liability to the campus at the same time. So step 1, one of the concerns that we heard on our campus is that, what are end users going to have to do for this process? So the answer is not that much. All we're requiring our end users to do is complete what we call a pre-purchase information form, and it's really basic. What is it? Who are your end users going to be? How many are going to use it? How is it going to be used? Is it going to be used in instruction? Is this something that's required for a course, for example? So this is all information that should be really easy for an end user to provide. And the other thing that they're responsible to do is ask the vendor for a VPAT. So that's it. That's pretty much all we're requiring end users to do in this process. Step 2, again, so the primary responsibility is the designee, the ATI designee, which points to the obvious that, well, you need to have someone assigned to do this, right? And so this person then reviews the pre-purchase information. What is it that we're buying? How is it going to be used? Takes a look at the VPAT to kind of, for the most part, get a sense of how knowledgeable do we think the vendor is about accessibility, and how will that impact what we tell them and what information we need to provide to them. And based upon that review, we're going to determine, okay, based upon impact and things like that, we're going to determine how deep dive of a review is appropriate. because as I mentioned, in the CSU, we have changed to we're prioritizing what we're doing based upon impact, and we really want to focus on those high impact purchases and make sure that we're doing what we should be doing for those at a minimum. So this is myth number 3. This is something I've heard quite a bit in the past, actually almost 9 years, and that we'll have people say, well, I just want a checklist. Well, the checklist isn't really that effective. It makes sense for some things, like yes, no questions, kind of a, did we complete all the steps? Did we include the language in our contracts? Things like that. But other than that, a checklist can't do, the meaningful things related to accessibility, such as, can a screen reader user complete this task? Are bitmap images used consistently through the app for navigation? Are headings used appropriately through the web page? Things like that. It just can't be done with a checklist. So step 3 is really the heart of our standardized process. And basically what you have is, there's a lot of different tools and things that you can use, and depending on the impact will drive what type of review you do. So for example, if we have a really high impact solution, such as our student training system that I mentioned earlier, that was kind of something we found out after the fact and wasn't necessarily the ideal process. If that were to happen today, what we would do is, we know this is super high impact, it's really important, really critical. We're going to hire a consultant to do a deep dive testing and provide a 30-page report to the vendor about what issues it has and what needs to be fixed, and or perhaps how to fix it, depending on the vendor's level of expertise. But the bigger question to us is, what do you do about everything else? Those high-impact ones are relatively easy to catch. We generally don't have any pushback from senior administration about the cost to do it, because they understand it's so critical. But then you have all these others that are, well, they're not necessarily low impact, but perhaps they're medium impact. It's required for a class. It's required for students. What are we going to do? So one of the easiest, cheapest things to do is, in the context of procurement, is, okay, we're going to have a vendor doing a demo, right? Let's just add some things related to accessibility during that, request for proposal or demonstration process to say, okay, when you're doing your dog and pony show, can you complete that process that you're describing and do it without a mouse? Just some simple things, and it will really kind of show you a lot about the vendor's understanding about accessibility or lack thereof, and give you a meaningful way, instead of just looking at a VPAT, to kind of understand where the vendor is and where they're likely, to be. How good of a partner might they be as far as working with you towards accessibility if you're to sign a contract with them. Back to the original question about the VPAT. So yes, we still do collect VPATs. So in the case of the lower impact things, what we'll tend to do is say, okay, we have a VPAT, but we're going to scrutinize every single piece of information on there. So that is things like no supporting comments. It's things like you have supporting comments, but they don't match the support level that was selected. Or you'll have things such as comments in different sections of the VPAT that are contradictory. So we'll go through that. We'll point out all the issues. We'll ask things like, you say you're going to provide support to your end users in alternate formats. What alternate formats do you provide? Just a lot of things to kind of put them on notice and say, we're not just going to accept VPATs anymore, and we're going to tell you where, at least just reviewing the document, where the deficiencies are, and we're going to require you to update your VPAT. And the same thing is, if we do more testing, we're going to require you to update your VPAT as a part of that process. The other couple things that can be done is, we use, for web testing, we use a product called Compliance Sheriff, which is an automated testing at enterprise level. And the automated testing has its place, but the caveat there always is automated testing can catch maybe 25% of the issues. You're pretty much always going to have a person do kind of the visual checks to say, okay, is this alt text meaningful? Is, a lot of those things that requires a human to actually look at it to see if it works, to see if it makes sense, things that just can't be automated. And one thing at our campus that we're starting to do a lot more of is some of the quick manual testing with assistive technology, such as your screen readers, such as your keyboard only. So you can do, and we've done this recently, where we spend literally maybe 30 minutes an hour, and we're able to come up with real concrete gaps in the products. And at the end of the day, we spent 30 minutes and an hour, and we've given the vendor some things that they can go back and start working on and remediate, versus kind of the old way where we're perhaps looking at a VPAT and we don't even know what gaps might exist. Then the last step of the process, the primary person responsible is the purchasing department buyer. And at this point, basically it's kind of doing what purchasing people do, is, again, using a checklist. In this case, makes sense that making sure that all the bid documents included all the accessibility language and requirements, the bid process, we followed all the steps that we're supposed to, the documentation from the ATI review is complete, and that our contract documents include all the provisions related to accessibility, including the main one, which basically says the vendor will indemnify us, they will respond to complaints, they will fix the problems that are found, and if not, we have an out to our contract. So Fresno State is actually piloting the standardized process for our system. And basically what it is, our work group developed what we think will work for all the different campuses, but until we try to implement it on a campus, we're not going to see where the gaps are, or things we may not have thought of, or things that need to be tweaked. So we're kind of verifying our processes, our recommended processes, our forms, and the guidance, and say, does this make sense? And it allows us to kind of build our training materials as we go. So right now, where are we in the pilot for our campus? We're kind of doing two really foundational things that we're actually about a couple months away from implementing. And what we're doing is we are actually redesigning and launching an online requisition form. And what we're doing is, instead of having accessibility be kind of a bolt-on to the process, we're actually integrating accessibility into our process. So it's becoming part of our actual requisition itself, and not just documentation, supplemental documentation that we're requiring, departments to submit. It's actually part of the requisition, which I think is kind of unique the way we're doing this. So we have these accessibility-related questions on the form itself, and based upon that, we're kind of using the automation and workflow to say the things that are really low impact, we're not going to ask for any more information. So we're using that system to kind of weed out and filter out the low impact things so we can concentrate on the higher impact things. And one of those things that happens is, if you answer, if you select the different categories of what you're buying on the online requisition and how it's going to be used, so if it's a high impact purchase, what it will do is it'll ask you, one, do you have an ATI review? Has it been completed? And if not, it'll then ask you at that point, right when you're doing the requisition, to provide that additional information that we need for the pre-purchase information about what is it, who's going to use it, how many users, that type of thing. So it's all, if you haven't done it proactively up front, we're going to catch it at the time the requisition is actually being keyed and just capture it all at one time. The other nice thing about our ATI review form itself is that this form will be used by our entire campus regardless of funding source. So at our campus, we have two different purchasing offices, one that focuses on state-funded purchases, and the other that concentrates on grants and contracts and foundation-type purchases. So the good news is we work collaboratively, and both of our offices require this form to be completed before we're going to process these orders. for technology. So this is just kind of a screenshot showing part of the online requisition form. And basically what it shows is there's a new section that asks the end users to just very easily select what type of technology items are you buying. Just check boxes and tell us a little bit, is this going to be single user that is going to be using this? Is it going to be used by your students? Is it going to be used in a public space? And basically what that does is those responses drive what workflow is triggered or not, whether it triggers that additional information pre-purchase form or not. And the other thing we've done related to IT is we're also addressing things such as information security. We're out about storing data and other things for tech work related. Do you need tech by the campus? Does this need to be supported during the implementation? So basically what happens is the end user submit on this single page form. It starts a little parallel process, ATI, one of them.
Tom, could I just interrupt you? We're getting some poor sound quality. It's kind of echoing from you.
Okay.
Maybe if you adjust your microphone, we can clear that up.
Okay. Any better?
No, this just started with the echoing, and it's staticky. I'm not sure where that's coming from. No one else has their microphone on except for me. And am I echoing for all of you? Could someone please let me know in the chat? Okay, so my audio is fine. It's just your audio, Tom. Is there anything there that you can adjust?
Okay, I'm trying to adjust this. Any better?
Can you just talk a little bit more? It sounds just staticky. I'm not sure we have the echo still.
Okay. Does that sound any better now?
That sounds really good, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so basically to summarize, so we're redesigning our requisition so it addresses a lot of new things, including ATI. And basically the main thing for end users is we're not asking them to have really any expertise or even know that these questions will trigger something related to ATI. It's just tell us what you're buying. So instead of, in kind of the olden days, there'd be a checklist. Tell us what categories of Section 508 apply. We're doing that intelligence behind the scenes. They don't need to know that. So from a flowchart perspective, you look at it, so our process can address either proactively requesting a review, or like I mentioned, you can do it when you're actually submitting the requisition itself. So what's changed is now we're asking pretty much just tell us, categorize what you're buying. Tell us if you have a pre-approval, and then tell us, is this personal use, things like this, and we'll basically be able to, based upon those responses, eliminate more than 50% of the items that we would typically need to look at, and we'll basically say, attach your VPAT and hit submit, you're done. But for those ones that are higher impact, we're saying, okay, now give us some more information, and we're capturing it all at the time of purchase. So things basically, the difference between the old days and now is it's no longer ad hoc catching things, kind of best effort. It's integrated into our purchasing process. So we're going to be capturing a whole lot more information and catching a lot more purchases. So kind of some final thoughts. So our recommendations based upon the work that we did in the standardization group is, look at all the roles and responsibilities that we've developed and figure out what gaps you have and address those. Figure out who's going to do it. If you don't have the people, hire people to address it, because really, if you don't have the people doing these things, you just can't have an effective process. So integrate your review into your existing processes. You're going to get more acceptance that way. It's going to be easier for your end users, and it's just going to be a lean process. Only ask for the information you need for those purchases that you need it for, instead of kind of a one-size-fits-all. It's just too much for end users when you do it that way. And prioritize efforts. It's really important. It's the only way to, especially with limited staff, to spend time doing a meaningful review and hopefully doing as much as you can to do at least some hands-on testing to get better information to provide back to the vendors. And proactively plan for what you're going to do for alternate access, because at the end of the day, pretty much everything has gaps at present. You're going to need to know, and the pre-thinking about what you're going to do is going to be really critical. So it's not can you provide the alternate access upon request, it's can you also do it in a timely manner. And the last piece is, because of developing a more meaningful process, we can collaborate with our vendors and actually move the progress forward. I can honestly say that with the vendors we've worked with that we've provided feedback, I haven't found one yet that wasn't willing to work with us, and or we've had a bunch of them that kind of had the light bulb go off and say, oh, that's what accessibility means, and oh, that's really not that difficult what we need to do to fix that. So it's not as scary from the vendor's perspective either. So at this point, I'll open it up for any questions that people have.
Thanks, Tom. That was really interesting. And those of you with questions, feel free to use your microphone if you don't want to type in the chat. Either way will work for Tom, I'm sure. So while we're waiting for questions, I'll pose a question for you, Tom.
Sure.
So you're going to make you set your PowerPoint, and I'll make that available on the website very soon. So in that PowerPoint, earlier you shared that URL,
yes.
The teachingcommons.cdl.edu.
Right.
Will we be able to follow your progress there? Will we be able to see your forms, and what will we see there?
Right. So yes, actually, everything is actually out there today. So you can see all of our forms, like the accessibility roadmap that I mentioned. There's our equally effective access plan form, like I mentioned. So all the boilerplate forms are there in their kind of initial, I don't want to call them a draft, but the initial version. And as we go through our pilot, you're probably going to notice updates to that site. So we're going to build it out. There's going to be a lot more training materials. Our FAQs right now are pretty limited. So definitely once we start doing a lot of the training and outreach, there's probably going to be a lot more content there.
Great, that's good to know. Couple questions in the chat. The first one from the Innovation Studio is, what do you do when a product has no VPAT?
So the first thing we try to do is say, here's the blank VPAT and here's our guidance on how to complete it. So we really try to, so again, if someone is saying they don't have a VPAT and they haven't completed one, what you're going to get back is probably going to be pretty bad. It's probably going to be especially lacking in detail and or understanding. But we still require that to kind of get them on board of, we'll accept this for now, but we're going to help you develop this, as we work with you over time. But we still always try to at least get one. If we have a vendor that just doesn't understand accessibility at all, then you just have to accept that we're not going to get a VPAT. But we're still going to do something to provide feedback to those vendors to say, here's some of the things that, if we can, depending on the impact of it, provide some feedback and say, well, you're still not off the hook. You still need to start working on this. Tell us, what you're going to do to make the product more accessible over time.
What if it's a larger, it's a company that has high impact, like let's say it's an LMS and they have no VPAT. What's your response to that?
Typically what will happen on that is that'll be part of a request for proposal process, and we'll actually write into the bid specs that if you don't provide a VPAT with your submission, you're out. We won't even consider you.
Great.
That's literally a minimum requirement for being just minimally responsive to the RFP.
Great, thank you. Christy Baldwin from Great Falls is asking, I'm wondering how people have responded and also how you got systemic buy-in for the importance of doing this.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of that question?
Sure. I'm wondering how people have responded and also how you got systemic buy-in for the importance of doing this. So I'm thinking Christy's talking about people internally within your system.
Right. So how have people responded? So at least at a campus level, we've always had support from the campus, even at the highest levels. It's something that's been represented at different presidential level committees. So they've responded positively, and I would say mainly because we have really taken pains to make this not where the procurement cops were going to stop you, or where the accessibility cops were going to stop you from buying the technology we want to buy. We've always really stressed that, okay, we understand maybe this process that we've done wasn't ideal, we're dealing with it after the fact or what have you, but making sure they understand we're there to help them. And we have really good buy-in, and they understand it's not an adversarial, we're not the typical kind of compliance, no, you can't do that because X. So I think we kind of have a different relationship because of that. Systematic buy-in, we have a buy-in on a system-wide level mainly because, one, it's a Chancellor's Office initiative. The Chancellor's Office is doing things to help campuses along. What the Chancellor's Office is requiring is not unreasonable, so it's been a collaborative effort throughout the system. So because of that, we have, buy-in from senior level throughout the system, if that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Tom. Christy says thank you. And Kari Goen at PSU is asking, what would you recommend for universities that currently have contracts with vendors that may have holes in their accessibility policy?
Sure. So that's kind of like contract renewals, continuing relationships. Of course, obviously it's better to when you put it into your initial contract, but I think most vendors, if you provide them the feedback about here's the things that we found and you want to work with them, I think they'll start addressing it. Instead of a kind of a mandate, you must do this, it's kind of here's the things we found, can you please provide feedback about when you'll do these things. I think most vendors, at least we found, most vendors are responsive to that, especially if you're providing that really good feedback about where the issues are. So that goes to the kind of the whole vendor, managing the vendor relation and not having kind of the confrontational, well, your product isn't accessible, bad vendor type thing, to we just want to help you, we understand it has issues, let's work together and let's work towards accessibility.
So Tom, Kari says thank you, but that creates another question for me. What about campuses that don't really have that top-level support for accessibility? There may not be an accessibility policy in place. What would you recommend for people who are working on accessibility, but they are not in this ideal situation? How do they deal with procurement then?
Right. It's challenging if you don't have that, especially even at the policy level. That's one of the things that was actually one of our work group findings, was that you really need to have that policy in place too, which kind of demonstrates to the whole campus community what your institution's commitment is to this. That's something we put in place about 2 years ago. You also need the people and the top level support to fund it too. It's really difficult if you don't have those things. And honestly, I can say that before I was in my current role, which is the ATI procurement manager role, which started about 2 years ago, it was really a struggle because I never had I didn't have the time or the resources to do what needed to be done, to do the trainings, to go to different conferences, to network with people. And it basically took me going to, we have currently today what we call, it's basically a CIO by committee. It's a group of senior executives that kind of serve as a CIO role. Basically, it took me going to them saying, I can't do this anymore, in, kind of as a side part of my procurement role, I can't lead the campus efforts for this. It's just not reasonable. I can't do it. I need more resources. I need more time. And then I got the support of senior management to say, okay, we're going to create this role and we're going to support it and we're going to fund it. But that's what it took to really make progress. Our campus, from a procurement standpoint, we'd have yearly reports that we submit to the Chancellor's office, and I can tell you that the first 5 years or so, our status indicators didn't really move much because we just didn't have anyone working even part of their time devoted to this. And it's made a big difference in the past 2 years. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yeah, it does. It tells me that there's a lot of grassroots work that has to go on too. Individuals advocating the way you had to advocate to get things in place. It just doesn't happen overnight.
Right, and related to that, I think I alluded to it, it's like, if it's presented to senior management as this is a compliance thing, as we must do this, I don't think they're going to be that responsive to it. It's just kind of a problem. Versus if you present it as, this is the right thing to do, this is why, this is about access, this is about fairness, this is about helping all of our students, I think that's going to get a better response.
Yeah, I totally agree. I see Kathy from Montana Tech wrote, I have another meeting, so I need to go. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Kathy.
Thank you.
And Janet wrote, we have had the resolution agreement and then grassroots also. So at U of M, we've responded to the complaint with the Office for Civil Rights. So that really, even though we had grassroots efforts going on, it really helped us get that support from leadership on our campus. So,
and I think it cuts both ways. I think you need both, and I think honestly, if we look at it honestly, that if there weren't some of these big settlements like the Penn States, etc., I don't know that everyone would necessarily take it as seriously as they do today. I mean, I'd like to believe that everyone wants to do the right thing, but different people respond to different things. And I think both together is making it so that we're starting to see a lot more progress, at least from my perspective, compared to where we were in the early days.
Yeah, and Tom, could you talk about the fact that, we hear these conversations where people want a database, where there's like the products you test,
right,
and the products we test. Why isn't there a database so we're all sharing that information? Can you talk about the perils of that, even though it sounds like a great idea?
Right. So I think generally speaking, there's a hesitancy to share. At least there was within our system. I think part of it is fear that, well, if people see what we do, maybe we didn't do the right thing, or maybe it wasn't, 100% accurate, or might even, I've heard people say, oh, well, will our campus be liable if someone else relies upon what we did? I think that's part of it. I agree that it could be a good idea, but I think the challenge is making sure it's not VPAT-centric. That's always been my issue with even what we did internally to have this repository of VPATs, which to me was, okay, so we have this repository of unreliable documents. However, if you had something that was a place where people could share, here's the actual issues that we found, based upon people hands-on, things like that, so it's really reliable, I think that could be really powerful and really helpful to a lot of people. This was a concept that was discussed at the accessibility sprint at HEAD in 2014, and they formed a work group to do something like that. I'm just not honestly sure what has happened or how that's progressed. I can check into that. I don't know if there's been a lot of movement on that.
Yeah, it would be great if you want to email our group back.
Sure.
And I know the EDUCAUSE IT Accessibility constituent group talks about this too, and they also feel that there's this risk of liability if things aren't kept up to date.
Right.
And Janet Sedgley in chat just wrote, Terrell Thompson just contacted me saying that there hasn't been much movement on that, so I guess we have an update.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, and you were going to say something. Go ahead. I think I interrupted you.
Sorry, I think I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Okay. And then Janet just wrote, he wondered about our openness to that also. It seems to be tantalizing. You know, and the other side of that too, I guess, is that, you know, you're working with vendors, we're working with vendors, all these, we know lots of universities across the nation that work with vendors, so we're all kind of reaping the benefit of this work, even in the absence of such a database right
like
now.
You mentioned, the IT Access Group, Athens, and others are doing some really great work.
Right, exactly. So we are just about at the top of the hour. I'm looking to see if there's any other questions, and I don't see anyone typing. If there, some people are typing. Kari says thank you. Janet says thank you for sharing. And Tom, thank you. I really, really appreciate this. I really learned a lot of good tips from you. So we'll look forward to following your progress and staying in touch.
Yeah,
and,
thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak to your group. I appreciate it.
Yes, well, we really appreciate your time and learning from you. I think this is a great learning experience for you as well as for us in terms of how this plays out over the years.
Collaboration is invaluable.
Yes, exactly. That's the key. So I see lots of thank yous.
Thank you.
Great process. Thank you from Great Falls. So anyway, thanks everyone for joining us. Next month, we'll see you the first Friday in June, and I believe Erin Page will be demonstrating new developments in math accessibility. So hope you can join us there. And Tom, if you would like to be on our mailing list, it's not too much email, but I'd be happy to put you on that.
Yes, please. We'd be happy to participate in that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. Well, everyone, have a good Friday. Tom, have a wonderful day there, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.